Okay, let's get going. So thank you all for coming today to this FIDO workshop. My name is Andrew Shikiar. I lead marketing here at FIDO Alliance. It's great to see all of you here today. Let's start off with a couple of questions. How many of you attended the FIDO workshop at CIS last year? Okay. For how many of you is this your first exposure to FIDO? Oh, wow. Okay, good. A good mix then. How many of you are with FIDO members? Okay. How many of you think that passwords are a good way to authenticate users, thereby providing a bad user experience and exposing risk to the enterprise? Okay, nobody. That's always often the case. So we're already kind of in sync, with that line of thinking. But it's good to be here at CIS. We give seminars like this all over the world. At a show like CIS, it's actually a pleasure for us to be able to get with identity insiders. We get a little bit deeper on the topics, a little bit more in-depth than we typically can. So we're looking forward to engaging with this more initiated audience, even for those of you who are new to FIDO itself. So speaking of which, this is the agenda behind me. We'll start with Brett McDowell. We'll walk you through kind of a recap of what we're doing at FIDO and some key updates since last year. We've made a lot of progress in some key areas. Tony Nadlin will then get into specifications. So a lot of exciting perspectives on the FIDO specs. After a coffee break, we'll come back and talk about how FIDO fits into government, and then do a couple of case studies on how both Facebook and Google have deployed FIDO authentication. Before wrapping up with a panel, an exciting adjacent space to FIDO, IoT. So talking about how does FIDO authentication play into the Internet of Things. All these sessions are meant to be interactive. There should be time at the end of each for questions, so please do ask questions at the end. And then also during the break and afterwards, you can engage the speakers one-on-one. As you may know, FIDO is a global organization. We have around 250 members worldwide. These companies have built FIDO certified solutions. So we have over 350 FIDO certified solutions. We have a pavilion on the show floor. So once that opens up this afternoon, I encourage you to stop by. We're in booth 330, 332. These are the 4 members who will be showcasing FIDO certified solutions in our booth. We also have a lot of other members throughout the show floor. So there's a good fit between FIDO and CIS. You'll see a lot of FIDO throughout the show this week. Last but not least, if you're so inspired and you're on Twitter, please use hashtag FIDOseminar to comment, give any perspectives on what you're hearing today during today's workshop. So with that, let me turn things over to Brett McDowell. Brett's the Executive Director of FIDO Alliance and is going to walk you through update and overview on FIDO Alliance. Brett.
Thank you. So what I'm going to try to achieve in the next 30 minutes or so is a quick overview of FIDO, because many of you raised your hands to that question. This is your first exposure to FIDO authentication. But the rest of the day is going to fill in all those gaps. I'm just going to give you some teaser, high-level information. Then there's a much more technical session, and then you'll see some case studies. So do stick around for all of that. But the other thing I'm going to try to do today is give you some updates. For those of you who have been following FIDO, let you know the latest and greatest of where things are as this market develops for simpler, stronger authentication. And if we're both lucky, I'll end a little early so I can take some questions. So let me start with who is the FIDO Alliance. So we're a nonprofit trade association. We have a global membership. Over 250 organizations that are either members or partners with us. We work with a lot of other trade associations. Many are represented here this week at CIS. And this particular list of companies on this slide are the board of directors. So representatives from all these companies comprise the board. The significance of that is that this is the group of companies that are setting the strategy for FIDO Alliance. They're kind of curating what we focus on, what we prioritize. And what I'd like to point out every time I give this presentation is the diversity of companies that are driving this innovation. This is not just a bunch of tech vendors looking to sell a solution. There is tremendous representation from the demand side, looking for simpler, stronger authentication. And that drives our priorities. We start with real use cases and real business problems, and then we develop the technology to solve those problems. So you can see we have market leaders, platform companies, Google and Microsoft, market leaders in fintech and banking and payment, Visa, MasterCard, American Express, ING, USAA, Bank of America. We have leading tech vendors for enterprise, RSA, Vasco, a lot of critical startups that have innovated in this space, Yubico, Knock Knock Labs, biometrics companies, Daon, Synaptics, Aegis, and others, many developers of security key technology. But the one thing that tends to get lost that I want to emphasize, especially to a room full of identity management practitioners, is the importance of the security capabilities in modern devices. So in the silicon, the chips, the secure elements, the trusted execution environments, this is critical to the security of authentication, because this is the new normal for where to store and manipulate credentials. We don't want credentials sitting around being sucked off your device by malware. We don't want them intercepted through social engineering attacks. And we'll get to more about how FIDO was designed to stop that from happening. But that explains why you see companies like Qualcomm, Intel, Gemalto, Infineon, ARM on the board of directors, because we're building the FIDO capability right in the heart, right in the components of all modern consumer devices. Because if we are going to solve the world's password problem, we need ubiquity. And as way of update, if you were here last year, I just want to point out these 4 companies have joined the board since our last report at Cloud Identity Summit. Facient, Gemalto, Fingerprint Cards, Line, and Rayon Secure. So Line is a new type of company to come into the FIDO Alliance. They are a messaging platform, #1 in market, ahead of Facebook and everyone else in Japan and Taiwan, and the fastest growing messaging platform in the world right now. All right, so let's talk about the problem that we came together to solve. The data breach problem, colloquially known as the password problem. So here's some evidence of the password problem. Over 80% of all data breaches studied in the Verizon Data Breach Report last year could be attributed to essentially passwords, weak, stolen, mismanaged credentials. So weak credentials because they're shared secrets. More about that in a moment. And as a result of that great success that attackers have of going after account credentials with simple, well-known, scalable, inexpensive phishing attacks, well, phishing attacks are up as well. 65% increase in phishing attacks over 2015, and that has led us to record numbers of actual executed data breaches, successful exploitation of this vulnerability that passwords all have inherently. And by the way, it isn't just passwords that have this vulnerability. One-time passcodes are now exploited in nearly as effectively as passwords themselves. Through automation and scalable attacks, attackers can automate the forwarding of that 6-digit PIN code just as easily as they can intercept the password. So this is happening at scale, and the ultimate problem is that the credential is a shared secret, which means the user has to give it away. That means the user can be tricked into giving it to the fraudster. Not to mention the security problems of password, let's focus on the usability problems of passwords, especially in the mobile era. So typing in passwords is something no user wants to do. They often abandon workflows when they're forced to do that. And you have the problem with the password resets and even enterprise policy of needing to change passwords all the time. So FIDO is not just for the commercial space. FIDO is also the right authentication solution for the modern enterprise. So to quickly illustrate why this problem is so bad and only getting worse, each and every quarter, each and every year, the data is worse than it was before. There is no slowing down of these exploitations and data breaches. And it's because the user is using the password or an OTP like a bearer token, and they're giving it to the application, so therefore it can be intercepted. Not only that, replay attacks. So when you do successfully exploit an enterprise and you walk away with a database of credentials, if you can crack the encryption on those credentials, which is being done more easily now than ever before, you can replay those credentials against other systems because people reuse their passwords. So we need something that's fundamentally new, fundamentally different from the ground up, that does not share this vulnerability, does not have this characteristic of being a shared secret. So FIDO is based on public key cryptography, asymmetric, private key, public key, key pairs. That's the new credential. That's the way forward, because you don't give away your private key. You just assign challenges with the private key. You just prove that you're in possession of the private key, which brings us back to why it's so important that there's secure storage on the device, protecting that private key. Excuse me. So to quickly, at a very high level, illustrate this, you'll get more detail on how this technology works after my talk. We have added a concept to authentication called the Authenticator. The Authenticator lives on the device. This is critical to the whole scheme of FIDO. The Authenticator is a logical capability. Just think of it as a capability. Don't think of it as some kind of physical manifestation. It is something that the device can do, and it is open to market innovation on how the device goes about doing it. So there are two things that a FIDO Authenticator can do for you. One, all FIDO authenticators create these key pairs and store the private key. They store the credential, and they sign challenges later when you need to re-authenticate the user. All FIDO authenticators do that no matter what the form factor, whether it's embedded or a portable authenticator. The second thing that FIDO authenticators can do, depending on what specification is used, what your use case is, the FIDO Authenticator can also do user verification. So that's an important distinction. All FIDO authenticators are going to give you proof of possession of a private key, otherwise known as a what you have authentication factor. Some authenticators will do more, and they'll give you a second authentication factor for true multi-factor authentication. And they'll do that often with biometrics, but it could be something like a PIN code. What's important is that it's local to the device. Whatever that challenge is to prove it's the same user that's using the authenticator, that challenge must happen between the user and their device. That cannot be an online challenge for the FIDO protocol. So you can use FIDO in combination with passwords, where you're just getting that second factor, or you can use FIDO to replace passwords. So the mantra for FIDO is it delivers simpler and stronger authentications. Let's review the simpler authentication. So you don't have to use passwords, so you save there. You can do a single gesture. Touch something, look at something, talk to something. That's the use case for FIDO. Nothing could be simpler than the way the vendors are bringing FIDO authentication to market. They're really optimizing the user experience. So you're definitely improving the user experience. You're reducing clicks, you're reducing friction on the user. And it works with commonly used devices. The whole strategy of FIDO is that we're going to get ubiquity on the device side. FIDO is going to be the new Bluetooth. It's just going to be on everything that's networked, that a user interacts with. And we also are simplifying this for the enterprise, because on the business side, you now can standardize on one way of doing authentication. So you can have the same authentication rules and policies no matter what the use case or what the end device, because the FIDO is an open standard protocol. And of course, it's faster and more convenient for the user. So let's review how FIDO is stronger authentication than what we're doing today with passwords and even passwords plus one-time passcode challenges. So it's based on public key cryptography again. So the private key is stored, never leaves the device. And there's no server-side secret. So not only are you helping with those real-time social engineering attacks because the user cannot give away their secret. Unlike a password or a one-time passcode, they cannot give it away. There's nothing in the functionality of FIDO that allows it. They can only sign challenges from the correct origin, and even if the correct origin were compromised, the attacker can't do anything with a signed challenge because they're never getting the private key. So the other thing that it does, besides solving the social engineering attacks like phishing, is it solves the replay attacks. Because if there is a credential database that is compromised and hundreds of millions of records are stolen, well, only the password credentials are going to be subject to replay attacks. The FIDO credentials are just public keys sitting there. There's nothing you can do with them. There's no third party in the protocol, so FIDO is a point-to-point protocol. And this is my opportunity, which I try to emphasize at every Cloud Identity Summit. FIDO is not federation, but FIDO works with federation. Just like you can use passwords and OTPs today to log into your identity provider and be federated downstream, you do the same thing with FIDO. Just where you see passwords today, that's where FIDO goes tomorrow. Biometrics, if you're using that for usability purposes, that biometric template must stay on the device and cannot be shared with the server. That is a FIDO requirement. So not all the biometric authentication that you read about that various companies are piloting and testing these days in the consumer space works this way. All FIDO biometrics do work this way. But some of those other solutions are still doing match on server with biometrics, which creates a database of biometric templates. That does not happen with FIDO. And there's no linkability between devices. So FIDO was designed with a privacy by design approach from the very beginning. You could imagine the temptation that some of the security and fraud experts had. Wouldn't it be great if we had a global unique identifier on all these FIDO authenticators? Then I always know, when this device is coming back and trying to maybe open other accounts, and I can detect fraud. The downside of that kind of architecture would be, but then now there's a global unique identifier and I can track this user across the web. So we do have no globally unique identifier. So there's nothing that FIDO gives the application to help them track user behavior around the web. So now let me give you an update on Phyto Certifications. So we not only produce standards, we also test commercial implementations of those standards to make sure that they conform to the spec and they interoperate with one another so that when you're out there deploying FIDO authentication, you know it's going to work with everything else that has that FIDO logo on it. This is the growth of certification over time. We launched this program in 2015, and I want to highlight this is the growth over the past year. Vendors are building FIDO compliant products and bringing them to market. There is now a rich ecosystem and plenty of vendor choice at every phase of deploying FIDO. Competitive FIDO certified servers, competitive FIDO certified clients, competitive FIDO certified authenticators and security key devices. And there's no slowing down in sight. So this market is really growing, gives you the confidence to deploy, knowing that you're not going to be tied in to any particular vendor. Now, let's talk about who's using these services. So this is not a comprehensive list, but these are some of the highlights of deployments. These are commercial services live in market today, built on FIDO certified implementations. And some of these are using FIDO to do both user verification and proof of possession of the private key. So some of these are multi-factor, like the biometrics that are used with eBay, PayPal, Entity Docomo, and Bank of America's deployment. And some of these are using FIDO for a strong second factor that's easier to use and much more reliable than a shared secret OTP. Some of those companies you're going to hear a lot more about today. Google and Facebook both have deployed that way, but many of these other companies here, including the UK government, Salesforce, and Dropbox. And these are the deployments since the last time we gave an update at Cloud Identity Summit. So Facebook, eBay, Keeper, Shinhan Bank in Korea, and the Bank of China have all deployed FIDO authentication in the past year. Now let's give an update on where we are with standards development. So what is in proposed standard status, which is the end of the road for us. This is like, we're done developing this version of the specification. It's out there. Intellectual property rights are granted to everyone. This is free to implement both by FIDO members and anyone else. You don't have to be a FIDO Alliance member to build a FIDO certified product. You don't have to be a FIDO Alliance member, of course, to use a FIDO certified implementation. So those specifications are known as UAF, Universal Authentication Framework, which gives you both user verification and proof of possession of the private key, and U2F, Universal Second Factor, which gives you proof of possession of the private key, often referred to as a security key, talking about the most popular form factor that FIDO U2F implementations are following. So everything's in 1.1, and soon we will be releasing a 1.2 FIDO U2F. Now, let's look ahead slightly. So there's something we call the FIDO 2 project. We partnered with the W3C. They formed a working group called the Web Authentication Working Group. We made a contribution of a web API and a few other components that would be needed for a web browser to have native support for FIDO authentication, so any website could use FIDO authentication without a plugin, without a third-party add-on. And that work has been going quite well, and we're almost at the finish line from a standardization point of view. And I'm not going to talk too much more about this because one of the chairs of that effort is the one who's giving you the technical talk later, so I'll let him fill you in on the details. But it looks like within the year, not only should this standardization be done, but live and in production across a number of browsers. And that's really gonna, I'm not gonna be able to fit all the logos on the deployment slide next year, right? So that's my prediction. Because once this is out there and ubiquitous across the browsers, why not turn it on? It's easier to use and more secure. So here's a little model of that. So we contributed to W3C. They've developed what they call web authentication. And web authentication works with the component that we standardize called CTAP. And that allows a use case that we'll see here where if you have a host device, when you think about it, FIDO is device-centric. So that means that you have to register your private key. You have to register credentials and bind them to your device each time you want to use FIDO to authenticate to an application. So if you get a new device, you have to re-register FIDO credentials to that new device. And for security reasons, we don't allow those credential stores to just get ported over easily, because then that would really increase the risk of credential theft, which is a problem we were formed to solve. So with that in mind, there's something called Client to Authenticator Protocol coming in the FIDO 2 set of specs, which allows interoperability between the device you've already registered some FIDO credentials with, could be a wearable, could be a security key, could be your smartphone, so that when you go to a new host device, a new multi-purpose device where you can run application like a laptop and you want to do FIDO authentication on the web, you don't have to re-register credentials on that laptop. You can use the credentials you've already registered on your smartphone to authenticate. And unlike push notification authentication, which is phishable, that's vulnerable to a man-in-the-middle social engineering attack, this is not, because the session is bound locally to your external authenticator. So the smartphone is talking to the host device, your laptop, locally. So that doesn't open up the man-in-the-middle problem that you get with an out-of-band push notification. So in summary, FIDO addresses a number of use cases from passwordless replacement, password replacement or the passwordless experience, often using biometrics, but you could also use a PIN code here. You could use both. You can do multimodal, multiple different biometrics. You could do behavioral. Whatever you want to do, FIDO doesn't standardize at that layer. FIDO stops at the abstraction layer, and we invite the industry to innovate on all the different ways that you could do user verification. This has led to tons of different and new biometric and other form factors coming to market. Or you can use FIDO simply to replace that more and more vulnerable second factor OTP with something that's easier to use and far more reliable. Last thing I want to give you an update on is FIDO and public policy, regulations, governments, and you're going to hear more about that today as well. So I'm only going to introduce this idea. FIDO Alliance decided we really were put in a position where regulation around multi-factor authentication was becoming a barrier to adoption. What happened is those few areas where multi-factor authentication has been regulated for some time, government enterprise deployments to a certain level of assurance, or payment industries around the world, really came to a forefront in the past 2 years with the European Union's work around PSD2, Payment Services Directive 2, which is binding on every licensed payment service provider in Europe, any European member state. They were defining something they called strong customer authentication. And they were doing it using old language that's been around for a while when multi-factor authentication was thought of as everything's going to be a shared secret. And so it had requirements like each factor must come from a different channel with the presumption that each factor must come from a different device. Well, that would really hamper what we're trying to do with FIDO to improve the user experience. We don't want people needing to go to 2 different screens and responding to do an authentication. And payments, as you know, has been let me try to say this the right way, a race to the bottom in terms of friction, right? So all the payment companies have been trying to squeeze all the friction they can out of the checkout process, the payment process, payment authorization. The last thing anyone in the payments world wanted was a new regulatory requirement that would force a terrible user experience on their customer base. They just knew that payment volume would be impacted by that because people would just abandon the checkout. So what we did is we started working with regulators and explaining how FIDO worked and how FIDO would deliver a true multi-factor authentication event from a regulatory and security and risk perspective, but with a single user gesture. So when you touch that fingerprint sensor, you're really getting a what you are authentication factor and a what you have authentication factor. And we also educated them around, kind of beware of the what you know authentication factors, because these are supposedly secrets, and in the age of data breaches, what's really secret anymore? The out-of-wallet questions can be easily known, and anything that's not easily known is easily stolen. So we really need to get away from knowledge-based authentication factors, or just say no to no, right? So that was very well received by the European Banking Authority, who's responsible for this regulation, and they've updated their language to reflect our recommended definition of strong customer authentication. And now, because they're the newest, most high-profile multi-factor authentication regulator in the world right now, we expect other jurisdictions to follow their lead and pave the way for single gesture, great user experience FIDO authenticators to meet all of the regulatory challenges for multi-factor authentication. So now I'm going to just leave you with an invitation to get involved. There's a lot of different things you can do. As I said before, there's no need to join the FIDO Alliance to participate in this ecosystem, to use the technology, or even to become a vendor supplying this technology to this growing market. But you are welcome to join the Alliance. That's going to get you in on the committee work that leads to these solutions, and it'll give you a leg up in terms of knowing what's coming next, as well as influencing what's coming next. But you can build solutions and go through our certification program. We can help with deployment. We're going to be writing more and more white papers. We have a great group that's focused on deployment best practices. Right now, they're mostly sharing lessons learned with one another, but eventually they will be writing up their consensus findings and publishing papers about it. So if you are on the verge of deploying FIDO, or you're looking at putting it on your roadmap, if you do join the Alliance, you're going to have that, like a user group experience with other deployers and learn from their experiences. And with that, I have a few minutes to take questions. Any questions about any aspect of this? Yes? Oh, I think there's a microphone. They're going to bring you a microphone, which may or may not work. Okay, sorry.
Are there any guidelines or standards for registering FIDO codes?
How to register them. So depending on if I'm interpreting your question correctly, so we have, when we say register a FIDO credential, we're talking about registering that FIDO credential, meaning you have a FIDO Authenticator, the application knows something about the authenticator because of something I didn't get into here, but you'll hear more about in the technical talk, the FIDO metadata service. So because the manufacturer of that authenticator can publicly advertise in a registry metadata about the authenticator. So here's information, maybe my certification level, what I'm doing to secure the private key, how I'm doing user verification, maybe something about its biometrics performance. All of that's available to the application. And then the user wants to register and create a new credential with your application. The protocol does define that flow. So that is all standardized on how that user would register a FIDO credential to work with your application. There isn't a notion of registering the device per se. You're creating a credential using the device with your application. That makes sense. That will probably make more sense when we walk through the technical talk a bit later. But this is a BYOD or BYOA, bring your own authenticator environment that we've designed for. So there isn't this notion that the authenticator or device needs to be known by the application a priori. You know, this expects the application to simply trust and allow these devices to create credentials to work with that application when they show up and they attempt to register with the authentication. So there has to be a one-time bootstrap. I need to authenticate this user before I let them register a credential, and we're basing that off of existing credentials. So yes, the very first time that I created my FIDO credential, let's say for my PayPal account, I used my PayPal username and password to do that. And after that, it was FIDO credentials. How are we doing on time?
Time for one more question.
One more question, over here. Can you hand her the mic now that it's working?
Hi, you mentioned federation and you also mentioned proof of possession tokens. Have you managed to get FIDO working with open standards like OpenID Connect, which brings you into the territory of proof of possession tokens?
Yes. So one of those deployments that I mentioned, I just touched on it briefly on that slide, was the UK government. That's the UK Verify deployment in the UK. One of the identity providers that are offering credentials to access government solutions is using FIDO U2F security keys, proof of possession tokens, in their deployment. And that is a deployment into a federated environment. That's not the only example. Google is an OpenID federating provider. And so Google's deployment does that. Facebook does that as well, using their own flavor of federation. But yeah, so FIDO's working in federation in a number of deployments. Well, thank you for your time. I will be around all week. Hopefully hear more from you. I'm giving a talk going into a bit more detail about our relationship with governments around the world on Wednesday. And as Andrew said, there's a lot of FIDO content on the agenda this week. But do stick around, get more information on the technical talk, case studies. Thank you for coming.